Hey, Brittany.
Hello.
Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
So I just want to let everyone know who's watching. My name's Amanda. I'm the owner of Anchor ABA, and today we're going to talk to Brittany, who is an old dear friend from South Carolina. We worked together for a couple of years, but I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell you a little bit about what she does and what she's been doing in Charleston.
Okay, so I am Brittany Kaye. I am currently a autism self-contained teacher, or we now call them low incidence room teachers. So I teach teenagers. I'm at a high school, so I teach teenagers up to age 21 with autism. And then before I did that, I just did in-home private ABA for about 7 years before I started teaching.
Yeah, those are some fun times. We worked together at a company down there in Charleston. And Brittany is one of the few people who taught me everything I know about the field. She's one of my original trainers back in the day. So I'm really excited to get to talk to you. So what I kind of want to talk about with everyone who's watching, especially the parents who's watching, I want to dive a little deeper into diversity and race in the world of ABA, especially those who are diagnosed with autism. We've got a lot going on right now, and I think that sometimes our kiddos who are diagnosed, are waiting to be diagnosed, who have not yet been diagnosed, some of these guys are falling through the cracks, and I kind of want to get that issue home and give some of you parents watching a couple takeaways that you can have, use, a couple outlets that you guys can go with. So Brittany, I know that we talked a little bit before we started recording about some of the things we wanted to chat about. So, specifically in your life with the students you service and you working in this field for over 10 years now, what can you speak to in the sense of what you see on a daily basis when it comes to race and diversity in the field of
ABA? Truly, there's just not much. So in my time doing ABA, I started working with kind of elementary school age kids with autism. My senior year of college, I did an internship, and it was just the social skills group, and it was kind of fun. And we hung out and worked on social skills and played games and did little outings, and we just met a couple times a week. So we had a elementary age group and a kind of older teen group. And in this group, we had one person of color between both groups. So, and then we got one more person of color, but in that whole senior year of college for me, there was just one person, two kids eventually that were children of color, and they didn't have actual diagnoses. So we kind of marketed this group as a social skills group, and I was told like, oh, most of these kids have autism, but we do have a couple that don't technically have a diagnosis. We think they just have behavioral problems. And that was kind of how it was presented to me. Mm-hmm. And it just so happened that the two that didn't have diagnoses were children of color. And I was kind of taken back by that, but I didn't know much about it myself. So I was kind of like, well, okay. And didn't think much of it. And then that same company I eventually worked for in Myrtle Beach, and it was a great company. However, I was the only person of color at the company. And it's a very large company. They've got lots of different programs. They've got therapy dog programs and consignment shops, and they have all of these different avenues that they go with. It's a huge company, but I was the only person of color at the company. And then none of the children that we serviced were children of color at the company. And that, again, I kind of looked at the situation a couple times after that, and I was like, that's interesting. And then I moved back home and decided to go to grad school for special education and work for the company that we both worked for. And I realized I never serviced any children of color at that company either. So, and we didn't have very many. We eventually did get some minority kids, but I was never on their therapy team. And I thought to myself that maybe it would have been an asset to be on their team, just so that the parents could get it and maybe feel a little more at home or feel a little more welcomed by by their therapist, because we are pretty intrusive. We go into their houses, so a lot of times we see, these parents in their pajamas and that kind of stuff. So sometimes it'll make you feel more comfortable to see somebody that looks more like you. And I realized quickly that that wasn't the case, that we didn't have very many clients that looked like me. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I'm missing something. And I kind of realized after going into the school system that it was a vast difference between some of the schools I worked at that were predominantly minority kids at these schools, and then schools that I worked at that were predominantly white. And I realized, okay, so there's a difference in everything, in that we're missing diagnosing students, we're missing students, and there's some stigmas that kind of get thrown out that, well, this student isn't well behaved, or, that's a predominantly Black school and those kids have lots of behavioral issues. And I think we're sure they may have behavioral issues, but I'd have a behavioral issue too if I'm worried about if I'm going to eat today, or if I'm going to, like if the lights are going to be cut on when I get home, or if I have a home when I get home. Like, those are things that when you look at communities of color and you look at the disproportional amount that are living in poverty, below the poverty line, well, they have got a lot of other things to worry about that would create a behavioral issue. And so are we missing some of these students that might have an actual medical issue? They might need to be diagnosed with something, even if it's not autism, with anything else, with some kind of developmental delay. Because if we look at their home life, well, then was the prenatal care there? So do they have some other, delay that has created what would be considered some kind of behavioral issue, when really they're just behind and they just don't have what they need? So I kind of, working with the school district, I was able to kind of go through and be like, wow, this doesn't start any specific place. It's just kind of, it goes way back to before we can even think about them being in school, and we have to think about their parents and what they've gone through and what they're going through and where they come from. And we have to kind of look at all institutions that are involved in the well-being of a kid or an adult with autism. And I think now that we have, the numbers are growing, and that's great. Like, at least we know there are more kids that are being diagnosed and they're getting diagnosed, but we still are behind the ball in diagnosing in the minority population.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of that is just absolutely fantastic information that, I think others are either just, we're not talking about it, or we're not focusing on it, or, maybe we're getting, caught up in different things. And we have a bit of a problem going on where these kids need this early intervention. We need early diagnosis. We need early care. I mean, it's been proven time and time and again from how many studies that these things are imperative to greater success in therapy, less time in interventions, less time with specialists. So this is huge. Brittany and I, for all those watching, we did a little bit of research before we started this, of course, and we were looking at some statistics that I will post below the video if anyone wants to look at them as well, that it was showing that white children are getting diagnosed roughly at 2-3 years old, the average, with autism, but then those in communities of color are getting diagnosed at 4, 5, 6, 7, sometimes later or sometimes never. With that, particular statistic in mind, Brittany, do you think that there is, are you seeing, from working on the front lines and being there, are you seeing this breakdown in getting the help, advocating for help, even just marketing that help's available? Is it some combination of that?
I think it's it's a combination of it. So I think autism, the word autism, is still pretty foreign to communities of color. Like, it still doesn't resonate where people are like, wait, what is that again? Like, we know there's lots of things like that. Those are the people with the puzzle pieces. Like, what does that mean exactly? I know even for me, in my little over 10 years, when I first started working with students with autism, I told my parents that's what that I was starting doing this internship with kids with autism. And they were both like, what is that? So it was one of those things where I was like, okay, well, that wasn't that long ago. Like, I'm 30. So at 20 something, I was telling them that and they were like, well, what does that mean? And so having to kind of explain to them what this is, and, it's still kind of a foreign word. I know in the Black community, it's not, I don't think it's intentional, but we kind of think, oh, well, that kid's just a little different. They're a little off. They'll probably grow out of it. And we don't think about any of these developmental delays, like, oh, is there help for that? Because I think historically speaking, there wasn't. So like if if we go back to our grandparents or great grandparents, even, there wasn't much that they could do about it. Like if they had a special needs kid that was, visibly special, there wasn't much that was done for that child. So if we can even look at simpler things like going to the dentist. My dad is 62 and he was like, when I was a kid, if you had a toothache, the dentist just pulled it out because that's all we could afford. We couldn't afford to get anything else done. Right. So when we look at like the historical plight of people of color, then we see that there wasn't much to do. So do they even think now that there's something that they should do? Well, no, if they grew up that way, there's nothing that we can do. So they'll go to school and maybe they'll get an IEP and they kind of rely on school to help, but they don't know that there's outside agencies that can help. They don't know that there's so many things that can be done. They don't know about ABA. They don't know about getting diagnosed. They don't know that there's a difference between your pediatrician and your developmental ped, because right. That's who you're going to get a diagnosis. And there is a difference. So, for a kid with autism that is healthy and they're eating fine and they're, like physically they're on par with their peers, but they're having some social and developmental issues, they don't know that that's a whole separate doctor that they need to go see to get an evaluation for. So, and then to ask from school, if they don't know, they don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So that's kind of where we're at when we look at just kind of graduation rates and education level. It's much less in minority communities. So when you look at it that way, of course, how would they know to ask for these things? How would they know that any of these things exist if nobody's there to tell them?
Right. No, absolutely. I think that speaks volumes to the ways we're getting this information out there. To kind of bring this back just a little bit to Anchor ABA, what advice would you have specifically for me, for all those who are watching, that I can get the message out there that there is help, there are support groups for parents, there are ways that we can make this accessible even without health insurance? What kind of recommendations, guidance would you give me specifically?
I think specifically getting out in these communities of color and truly just marketing yourself, just saying, hey, this is something 1 in 50 kids has autism now. So
right.
That means 1 of 50 children you interact with probably is on the spectrum, in which case, if you're worried about what that looks like, and I think that's probably a big thing too, is explaining to people that it doesn't look like the movie Rain Man, like that's like a very small portion of people with autism. So, we see these, or what's the Netflix, The Good Doctor, those are very small portions of what we see. So I think if that's what we have to go on, if general society has to go on like what we see in the movies, right, well, then we're not going to even think that oh no, my kid's nothing like that. We don't that. So right. We're not on the spectrum. Right. And to understand that on the spectrum could literally be just, my kid just doesn't talk to other students, but everything else is great. Everything else is fine. Then they could still be on the spectrum. I think kind of putting it out there that it looks completely different ways. And these are all the ways these are all the signs to look for. And then kind of just putting yourself out there, like, here are the next steps you should do. So if you're worried about your student, then ask your school for an evaluation, because lawfully they have to do one. So if you request it as a parent, we don't have a choice. It's like, if a parent requests an evaluation, we have to do one. We cannot deny that. So
Good point.
If your first public school is good, you got to send your kid to school. So at the very least, say, hey, I want to request evaluation because I think something is going on with my student, and don't let them talk you out of it. If you want to know, worse, it's better to know than to not. So even if it comes back that your kid's perfectly fine, great, fantastic. And that's awesome. And that's what we hope for, but it's better to know than to not. So ask school for an evaluation, and then just on your end as a company, just getting out there and providing this information as best you can. And I know, and it's hard. It's hard. It may be like oh, well, I'm here at some rally or some block party or anything in the community that's going to have lots of people coming through and giving you a lot of foot traffic. Those are going to be your best bets. So I know here in Charleston, we have the Moja Arts Festival, which is celebrating, Black culture. And we do a like a health and wellness fair. And I sit out there and just talk about ABA from a health and wellness perspective. There's just so many people that just don't know. And I was like, even if you don't have a company to go, y'all have a company to go there with, which is awesome. But getting out there at any of these things, at farmers markets, at flea markets, because that seems to be something that minority groups love, a flea market. So if you can put out your information as well as best you can, just so that people can know, it's not that it's not out here. It's just, you didn't know where to.
It's not accessible.
Right.
Awesome. I do just want to make a note, because you made an awesome point as you were talking, that there are some signs, there are some developmental red flags, some signals, some things that parents should key into. If parents want to know a little bit more about those red flags, I have an entire list on my frequently asked questions on my website. So I will put a link down there as well. That is something, like Brittany said, that you go to a developmental pediatrician, or you start, if you don't have a developmental pediatrician, you start the conversation with a pediatrician or a trusted teacher, or somebody who can get you through to the correct individuals who can test and diagnose. So that was excellent. I just wanted to let parents know that is available somewhere where they can at least reference a pretty hefty list of some things that they pay attention to.
And I know Autism Speaks has a quick little 2-minute kind of survey that way you don't. I want parents to know that it doesn't require a whole lot of labor to do, because sometimes it can be overwhelming. I know I go to a doctor's appointment and I hate filling out the initial form that's like, what's your insurance? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know any of these answers. So having something that's a quick reference is always great. So just, that's a good place to start, even if you're not sure. Absolutely. That's a great place to start, and it's quick and it's easy.
Absolutely, yeah. Always, Autism Speaks is fantastic. Totally right with that. That's a perfect one. To kind of bring it to some parents, I kind of want to target them. You brought up a really great point a little bit earlier when you were speaking, and you were talking about going into a room or going into a home and not having someone who looked like you. And you are a part of a community that you are fantastic at. You are a fantastic therapist. You're wonderful at what you do. I respect you. I know others very much respect you in your field. So kind of having that comfort level. And I'm sure parents also have that comfort level that you were talking about, where kind of wanting to trust the person who's coming into their home or feel comfortable asking for help. If there are parents out there who are watching, who may be a part of a community of color, what kind of advice or guidance can you give them to start the process if they're thinking, okay, this might be my child, or this might be something I need to look out for? Where could you guide them to start to get them a little bit more comfortable? And what kind of advice do you have for them?
I think the best, or at least in my experience, the best situations for me where I was going into someone's home and I knew that maybe they were a little reluctant or they weren't sure what to expect, was trying to just sit down and have that conversation with the parent first. Kind of lay out like, hey, this is what I want to do with your kid. Tell me how I can make your life easier. Those kinds of conversations where you can be very frank and say, hey, let me know what are things that you allow and don't allow in your house so that I know how not to offend you or whatever. Those are, from a therapist perspective, that's a great thing to do. And then from a parent perspective, just putting out there like, hey, this is some of the stuff we do. We would love for you to participate. This is some of the stuff we don't do. That way you can know. That way you don't come in and you're trying to learn on the fly. And it's especially in other cultures. I did work with a kid that was Indian, and there was a lot of different rules that I didn't know could have been offensive. Even just what I wore to the house, like that kind of stuff. I was like, I probably needed to know that. Or even if it's a simple rule as I don't like shoes being worn in my house. Those are those things that you want to kind of get out of the way beforehand. So if you can provide that to your BCBA and say, hey, these are some of our kind of general house rules. Can you relay that? And then have a meeting before you're directly working with a kid. So parents, it's imperative to have that relationship with your therapist. That way they kind of know what the plan is. Invite them in to be a part of the therapy team. Parents, make sure you come in and participate. That way you don't have to question what's happening with your kid because you were there. You saw it. You saw exactly what's going on. And that's another thing that I think sometimes gets lost when doing ABA is that you're like, well, this person's here to help my kid and I don't necessarily need to be a part of that. Or that gives you a break. And absolutely, you need a break. Parents, you need breaks. But every once in a while, if your kid's getting therapy 5 days a week, well, maybe one of those days you want to sit in on that session just so you can see it. And that's going to help with everybody feeling more comfortable and feeling like it's a cohesive team, as opposed to this person comes and just works with my child and never talks to me and vice versa. We want to make sure that we're respecting each other mutually, and the more conversation you have, the better it's going to be.
Awesome. No, that's fantastic. That's awesome. Absolutely awesome advice. I think our parents can really benefit from a lot of that, hopefully. Now, couple more questions before we kind of wrap everything up. And I super appreciate you sitting down and talking to us and kind of having this open conversation about everything. On the professional side, hoping that there are some maybe special education teachers to be, or RBTs to be, or BCBAs to be, or whatever have you that may be tuning in and watching and being a part of this conversation with us. From your experience going back to being someone who you said you walked into a room and sometimes you were the only one who looked like you in that room, what kind of advice do you have to kids out there, boys and girls, who want to get into this field and maybe feel like it might not be something that's kind of theirs to chase after? Do you have any advice for them? Do you have any encouraging words?
I'd say just go for it. I felt like as a Black person kind of going into what seemed to be kind of a predominantly white field, I just had to do it. Like I just had to go for it and kind of prove myself. And I think that's you're just going to have to do it. I think if we can kind of break down those barriers and those stigmas, then everybody's going to feel more comfortable, because I'm sure that all of these professions, teaching, ABA, BCBAs, we're all missing the the diversity that we need. And so if you just don't be afraid to go for it. Don't let the fact that maybe you're a person of color or not a person of color in certain situations, because I know plenty of teachers that are white and work at a predominantly Black school, and it was very intimidating for them at the beginning. They were like, I just didn't know. I didn't know how the kids would respond to me. Go for it. If your heart's in it, then you're going to be good at it. So I would say just do it. Don't worry about what somebody's going to think or how they're going to feel. If you know that you've got the skills for it, and you know that you know your stuff, then you're good to go. So I'd say just go for it. That's kind of what I did. I said, well, I'm just going to do it, and we're going to see what happens. And it worked out great. So I would say
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's awesome. That's really good advice. And hopefully it resonates with everyone who's watching, and everyone, can kind of take that away from it. So kind of just to recap a little bit for any parents who are out there watching, some of the advice that Brittany and I were trying to get across to you is, if you are in a lower social economic class, if maybe you don't have access to insurance, that does not mean that you don't have the right to get your child tested or evaluated. Like Brittany said, public schools, that is a good place that you can talk to teachers and talk to them about your concerns. But even before that, a simple pediatrician visit, they can at least try and direct you to the correct place. If you struggle with getting them there, there are other resources. Like Brittany said, Autism Speaks is a great one, great nonprofit that's, kind of global. We also have the Autism Society of Cincinnati. They are another nonprofit. They work really closely with families. They have a lot of great things, free support groups, free information helplines. These are all things that you guys definitely should access if you need to access those. I think that's a great place to start. And like Brittany said, having those open discussions, being frank with, if you get to the point where you are having therapy, if something is not allowed in your home or is allowed in your home, just communicate that with your team. Let them know what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with. So that, like Brittany said, we can bring everybody to the table and ensure that we're kind of getting everyone back in. We don't want kiddos to fall through the cracks. We don't want families. Like Brittany said, everyone needs a break. Every parent needs a break, even if your child is not on the spectrum. So especially if you're one of those families falling through the cracks, you're like, man, I need a break. There are resources out there, and we would love to get you in touch with those, even if that's not with Anchor ABA. If that is with somebody else, I want to help you access those and find the best path for you. But with that, Brittany, thank you so much for chatting with us. This has been. I'd love to talk to you again. Maybe we can hit another topic in the future because this was absolutely wonderful. I hope everyone out there enjoyed it and really learned a lot from it. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. I'm more than happy to help.
Thank you again.